Good afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. My name is Stephen Miles, and you are here at the panel for Netroots Nation on Afghanistan, the costs of war, the future for Afghans, and how to end our endless wars. As I said, my name is Stephen Miles. I go by he, him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Win Without War. I'm honored to moderate today's panel and our conversation, and we appreciate all of you joining us. Afghanistan has obviously been in the news a lot over the past few months and weeks, and I'm quite sure that we'll talk about the recent events during today's discussion, but we also want to talk about the bigger picture, the last 20 years of the US war in Afghanistan, not simply the last 20 days. For that conversation, we have three amazing panelists today who've each been working or impacted by these issues, even when they were not in the news. And so today we're going to be talking about their experiences, the lessons they've learned from their work, what progressives need to know and do going forward. Before we go any further, I'd like to remind you all that you can ask questions of our panelists using the chat feature. We'll start in a moment with some questions I have for our panelists, but our goal is to have a real and genuine conversation today. So we'll be pulling from your questions to help guide us as we go through the conversation. So put those questions in whenever you'd like. With that, let's get right into it. As I said, I'm excited to be joined by three amazing experts, activists, and leaders for this discussion today. You can read their full bios in the Netroots app or on the website for this panel, so I won't repeat it all here, but let me just quickly tell you a little bit about each of them. Arash Zizada is an artist and community organizer and a leading activist in the Afghan diaspora community. Arash recently helped co-launch Afghans for a Better Tomorrow and has been on the front lines of the recent crisis, working to help both aid Afghan refugees as well as those remaining in the country. Pam Campos Palma is the Director of Peace and Security for the Working Families Party. A former military analyst, Pam served in Afghanistan in the Air Force and has since become a fierce, tireless champion for peace. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Nita Crawford is the co-founder and co-director of the Costs of War Project and also the chair at Boston University's Political Science Department. Her and her colleagues' groundbreaking work has helped track both the human and the financial costs of our 2 decades of post-9/11 wars. So with that, let's get right into the conversation. Arash, I'd like to start with you. As I mentioned, you've been doing amazing work through your new organization, Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. If you could start by telling us a little bit about the situation in Afghanistan now, how we got here, what's needed, and what should activists in the United States be asking of our elected officials in this moment?
Thanks, Stephen, and I want to thank Netroots for having me on. This is obviously a really important topic and something that I and so many others in our community have been dedicating these past few weeks to. But I think the best way to summarize the situation in Afghanistan is that we find ourselves in the biggest crisis moment in roughly 20 years. There are millions of internally displaced people within the country. There are thousands of people who are now currently in safe houses within the country. There are, I would say, between 250,000 to 1 million people who are searching and reaching out to us and so many others to find some type of route for evacuation. And then the situation gets a little bit more dire than that as well. The banking system is on the brink of disaster, and so is the medical system. So we are now looking at a humanitarian disaster of huge proportions, probably unmatched also again in 20 years. There was a UN report last week that said 98% of the Afghan population could enter or plunge into poverty by mid-2022. So the alarm bells are ringing in pretty much every industry, sector, or area of concern. And so I wanted to quickly also to talk about what's happening or people that are seeking evacuation. Now we have folks who are they're looking for evacuation routes out of the country, but they are in safe houses. And then they are also in safe houses in neighboring countries like Pakistan and Tajikistan. And then there's roughly 100,000 people who have made it somehow to the United States or Western European countries. We have thousands of folks in countries like Albania and Macedonia, perhaps some really odd countries for Afghan nationals to find themselves in. And so the work that we are doing kind of is all over the place, to be quite frank. You know, we are doing donation drives to get warm clothes to folks on military bases, while we are also advocating for humanitarian aid to go to Afghans in country. And then we're also worried about legal status or a legal pathway. Kind of the same fight so many other immigrant and diaspora communities have been fighting. So I would divide them into three parts specifically. You know, there's Afghanistan in country. There's what's happening in the neighboring countries where people are kind of like stuck in transit somewhere, whether it's in safe houses or somewhere where they are undocumented without some kind of legal status. And then there's like the huge road ahead that's coming up for so many Afghans who are now entering a country who are deeply traumatized, who were members of civil society. They were journalists, they were activists, they were judges. You know, they were members of sports teams. The girls' robotics team has made their way out. So we're looking at a variety of different people. And, you know, as a community organizer in the Afghan diaspora here in the United States, we have quite a marathon or long road ahead in terms of ensuring they become part of the American fabric and that they get all the support that they need. So I think, you know, for folks who are can be of any help in the progressive advocacy lanes in the United States, you know, like the biggest area of concern is passing some type of legislation that not only provides a legal pathway to citizenship, to legal status within this country, but that also helps them with housing and social services. Mental health will be a really, really big part of that conversation to ensure that these folks land on their feet here in the United States.
Thank you, Arash. We're going to come back to you in a little bit to talk more in depth about some of those ways we can help out, and also a little bit more about the 20 years that came before this that you referenced. But first, I want to turn to Pam, and I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about your experience in Afghanistan, what that taught you about the reality of our endless wars, and how that informs your work now at the Working Families Party.
Sure. Thank you for having me as well. So I enlisted in the Air Force out of high school, like many people who are looking for opportunity. My mom, who's an immigrant, is the one who told me to sign up so I could have money for college, security. And I think there was a part of her that felt that if I joined the military, maybe, just maybe, her daughter might be a little bit American enough to be shielded from systemic racism in this country. And, you know, I chose to be an intelligence analyst, not knowing what it was. I didn't know anyone who had ever served in the military before. But I wanted to make my family proud. And I really believed in helping others. And that's what I thought I was going to go do. And, you know, I chose intelligence. As an intelligence analyst, my job was to gather information and to determine a threat picture and recommendation for decision makers, whether they were law enforcement or pilots or commanders. And one of the first things that I focused on both Iraq and Afghanistan. And a few things started coming to light for me as I was in the seat. One was moral injury, just a crisis of consciousness for me, where I started really questioning if the way we were doing things was actually helping rather than hurting. And I think one of the biggest ways I saw this was it was my job to report on a routine basis, killed in action, wounded in action. And immediately I remember just feeling so jarred by how, one, me constantly saying these numbers didn't bat an eye from folks, and that I was only giving the numbers of American troops and contractors, and we weren't actually paying little to any attention to Afghan nationals, locals, and partners, actually. And so I felt a real mixed message where, you know, and to put this into context, I enlisted in 2006. And really the height of my work around Afghanistan was in 2009, where there was a lot of challenges, particularly in the Helmand province, which is where I was really focused around. In 2009 was also the emergence of this, you know, cultural support team strategy and the hearts and minds strategy, which frankly, to remind everyone, the hearts and minds strategy, which is to basically use a very altruistic strategy of working with communities to not use superior force, is a strategy that spans back a long, long time was a cornerstone of the Vietnam era, was something that was propagated in Iraq, and then came to Afghanistan. And I remember there was a moment where I thought maybe this might work, but I continually just saw a pattern of, one, not treating Afghans as real people, and two, a choice I saw continually made is save face rather than actually listen to the intel that things did not make sense and things were not working. And I think, in the last 6 months, watching kind of this trickle of this crisis in Afghanistan with the US exit, I've thought a lot about how, as an intelligence analyst, when I tried to intervene, I was told to shut up and color. I was told that I was being a disruption. And in fact, sometimes I was retaliated against. And so what I have learned, and a lot of what my work has focused on, is organizing the military and veteran community to be anti-imperialist and to actually bring a lens of what does ending wars mean, in a way that is not just let's cut the cord and who cares about everybody else, but actually about building a better future that is of true safety and security and global justice. Because at the end of the day, the 20 years of occupation of Afghanistan, and frankly, the bigger global war on terror, continues, right? And is frankly becomes so part of our fabric of this country. The way that we think about surveillance and security, and all of this is so normalized, is part of the interruption that myself and other anti-imperialist veterans have really tried to anchor. I hope that answers your question, but I think I missed something.
And it does. We have a lot to get to. Yeah, go ahead.
One last thing. Drone strikes. I also came into a time where there was, when I was in uniform, I was actually one of the people that was told, well, you could get a bonus if you went to go be a drone operator. And what's fascinating to me is that, this is killing, right? Like, this is secretive killing that actually creates more destruction and death. And fundamentally, I say this as an intelligence analyst, fundamentally worsens the plight of political violence. We know, right, that kinetic military force actually only creates more violence and more warring. So I just needed to put that it's interesting that in our exit that was a strike that happened, and that still requires accountability for the bigger drone program.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, and similarly, as I said to Arash, I think we'll be digging deeper into these topics as we move forward. But first, Pam, you brought up a really good point about the lack of counting of the costs of these wars, the lack of a full-scale kind of accounting of the damage that was being done. And I think we all owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Dr. Crawford and her colleagues at the Cost of War Project for the work that they've done to actually do the research and put those numbers there. And so, Nita, I'd love to hand it over to you and to talk a little bit about what you found in your research or your colleagues' research on the true costs of the last 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, both for the financial costs, but also most importantly, the human costs.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to participate in this. And I want to say, first of all, that the Cost of War Project is about 50 people over the 10 years of the project. I have particular areas that I focus on, and I'll focus my remarks here on those. But we have had papers, for example, on drone strikes. We have had papers on the lack of special immigrant visa processing. The project tries to support the work of activists by providing background information, and that's really the goal. So my focus in the Cost of War Project has been tracking the number of people killed in the war zones. The 85 places that we're presently operating, I can only track a few of those using other people's work and trying to add up the numbers. And then I also looked at airstrikes in Afghanistan in particular, and accountability for civilian casualties in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria. And I've been totaling the total budgetary costs of the post 9/11 wars. as well as finally working on US military greenhouse gas emissions. So just let me say a few things about the human toll, the really big picture here, which is that obviously the war occurred in Afghanistan, but it also escalated into Pakistan and affected many thousands of people there, especially in the area then known as the Fatah, the tribal area. And when I talk about civilians killed and injured, I want to always remember those Pakistanis who essentially have been, except for the brief moment when we talked about AFPAC, out of the picture. So in the war zones in Afghanistan, about 176,000 people, including civilians, were killed. In Pakistan, another 67,000 people killed. And a good portion of them has been civilians. In Afghanistan, it's about 67,000, and Pakistan, 24,000, which adds up to about 70,000 people killed, civilians killed. Now, that's the direct deaths, right? So what we also have to keep in mind, and Arash mentioned this, is that there are reverberating effects, consequences that we call indirect death. When the United States destroys infrastructure, and it's the United States and its allies destroy infrastructure, what happens is that the capacity to sustain a way of life that includes medical care, safe drinking water, access to vaccines is disrupted or altogether severed. And that's what we're seeing now, the indirect morbidity and mortality of having the entire country been at war for 20 years. So I haven't calculated indirect death because we simply don't know how to do it well. But I would say that of the basically 250,000 people who've been killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan total, nearly 250,000 people, we could say that if we thought about indirect death, there's at least that many people who were harmed and died as a result, and maybe many more than that. And Arash already mentioned the many people who were displaced internally and who've been put into a diaspora. So that's the human toll. And I think it's important to talk about indirect death because that's the legacy. And I haven't mentioned injuries. The many people, we see a lot of images of US service members who've lost limbs or eyes. But there are many people in these war zones that have as well. And Handicap International and other organizations try to help them, but this is an ongoing legacy. Then I'll quickly say something about the budgetary costs, and I want to talk really basically in three baskets. One is the past spending, what we've already spent in the US, and I'm not including our allies who've actually, by their own spending, have subsidized the US effort. Made it possible for the US to spend less than we would have otherwise. So that's war spending by the DoD and the State Department. Then there's the fact that that we did not tax for these wars or ask people to buy bonds, so there's interest on borrowing to pay for them. And every time we make a debt payment, an interest payment on the debt, we're paying in part for these wars. There's the cost of veterans care, and there's increases to the Department of Defense base budget. And I want to say a little bit more about that in just a minute, because the base budget is incredible once you understand what's going on there. So that's the past spending. And that's about $2.3 trillion. That is $2,300 billion. And then there's future spending, and that's spending on veterans' medical and disability care, which Linda Bilmes with the project has estimated may be another more than $2 trillion for both Afghanistan and Iraq. And why can't we say one or the other so well? Because people served in both war zones with repeated deployments. And then there's future interest on the debt. But what I said earlier about the base budget is really important. When active war spending went down, what they call the OCO budget, Overseas Contingency Operations budget, or up. The base budget basically went up. That is the stuff that's the ongoing, funds the ongoing activities, what is considered normal. So essentially, the post 9/11 wars have been an inflationary factor, inflating the US military base budget. So the high war spending that we've seen, over 600 and now $700 billion annually, will continue because the base budget has grown. And that's really important to keep track of. And then the third basket of cost is the environmental costs. Well, actually, I forgot something here. I want to talk about the opportunity costs of the high spending on the military, which is military and veterans care spending is more than half the discretionary budget. It's hard to imagine that this is what we do with all this money, but it's more than half, and it's not productive spending in the sense of creating more jobs than other types of spending. So, for the cost of these wars, we could have done everything that Biden wants to do to fix the economy. We haven't. For the cost of future infrastructure, we could have fixed everything in the economy, including healthcare, and helped the countries that we've actually devastated. And then there's the greenhouse gas emissions, which were heading down in the DoD and then spiked up after 2001, and only in recent years have begun to go down again. So I could say a lot more about the way the wars have continued and what we can expect in terms of future costs, but I'll stop there.
Staggering, just absolutely staggering costs. Nita, thank you for laying them all out. I want to remind those watching online, you can put questions in the chat for our panelists, and we'll come to them throughout the conversation. But for now, I want to open it up, and I want to take us to talk about the media for a minute, because I think there's a reality to the fact that the costs that you were just talking about, Nita, the tragedies that you've been talking about, Arash, the experiences you've been talking about, Pam, we saw a lot on the media about 4 to 6 weeks ago on Afghanistan. Yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the start of the US invasion. It didn't make news. There wasn't much conversation about that. During the Trump administration, it was some of the deadliest years for civilians in Afghanistan. In fact, it was, I believe, one of the first years of the war that US and Afghan forces killed more civilians than the Taliban. Almost never mentioned in the news. I wonder, as you think about what happened, what we've been through during the course of this war, but also the experience of the media's attention during the drawdown. And to use an example, Pam, I'm glad you brought up drone strikes. The drone strike that happened in Kabul that's been deeply investigated, and we now know was completely a lie, what we were originally told as part of that it was an aid worker and his children who were coming out to greet him when he got home. And that got attention because of the news media being there. But we also know that that is not the exception. In fact, it's much more the norm for the last 2 decades of this war, and in fact, the US drone program. How do you think we should think about this as progressives, as activists? How do you think we should think about the role that the media has played and how they've covered this war from your different perspectives, and what we should do about the next time they begin championing going to war somewhere? And I'll just leave that open for whoever wants to jump into it. I should mention while you all debate who's gonna jump first. The one thing the media has on occasion done right is have all of you on there in different places. And if you haven't seen Marash's segment on Sam B's show recently, I highly recommend it. Yeah, you were fantastic there. And I think we need a lot more of all of your voices in the media. But hopefully someone wants to jump in about kind of what they think the media got wrong and what we should take away from it.
Well, I actually want to go back to the fall of 2001. And there was a moment there, well, it took us 7 days to decide to go to war, right? And in that time, there was actually a possibility to have a conversation. about whether or not it was advisable to go to war. Yet, essentially, anybody who was anti-war was not in the picture. What happened was that immediately we went to experts to tell us how we should best use military force should the Taliban not cave and produce Osama bin Laden. And when the Taliban did offer to provide Osama bin Laden, there was hardly any discussion of that. And then the same, of course, we now know about the Iraq War, very little critical analysis by the media. Now, why is that? I think it's because of two factors. One is the rally around the flag, the sort of fear of not being seen as patriotic. And beneath that is the unquestioned militarism that many humans have, many Americans have, and journalists are not immune. In other words, many people believe that force is the best, the quickest, the cheapest, the most controllable of the options on the table. And those two things combined, not wanting to be perceived as unpatriotic and believing the taken for granted assumptions about the effectiveness of military force, meant that the discourse was really circumscribed from the beginning, and that throughout both wars, the major wars, and we also see this in regard to the 80 other places we're fighting currently, the media has not had the capacity, or in some cases the willingness, to look outside the DoD for experts. In fact, many of them have offices very close to the Pentagon. And there are certain media personalities, for instance, Tom Friedman, who essentially put his finger up to the wind, and whatever the elites were saying, he sort of tried to amplify it. And I think that that's been a disservice to us. This is not a fourth estate. It's basically an arm of the executive branch. And then unfortunately, Congress has not helped. They haven't provided an alternative source for spokespeople analysis. Congress has been quiescent from the beginning. And if there were real leadership there, I think the media could have an opening to have conversations which were more questioning. Now, of course, there have been from the beginning members of Congress like Barbara Lee who have not sort of saluted and gone along. But I think for the balance of these wars, members have not given us the news, like hearings, that would have provided an opportunity for investigative journalists and the media to dig deeper.
Arash, let me maybe jump off of that and ask you a question, because I think Nita brings up a really important point that I see you and your organization trying to address, which is almost always these conversations in Washington about U.S. foreign policy do not include the communities who are going to be impacted by these decisions. They don't include the members of the diaspora of those communities here in the United States. They certainly don't include people in the countries that we're often talking about. You know, if you watched TV during the month of August, you would be excused if you thought that you were required by some sort of law to have been a general in the war in Afghanistan to comment on Afghanistan, or that no Afghans were willing to talk on television about the war. You've been leading efforts to try to change some of that. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, but also why is it so important that we really not just begin to change the conversation in Washington, D.C. about these issues, but change who is in those conversations, to include the very people being most impacted by U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of our organization's task that's in front of us, on top of the 321 other things that's really important to us and pressing at the moment. But narrative building and ensuring that folks from our community, and not just the diaspora specifically, but just impacted communities are heard is just been such a, it's been such an obstacle. It's been so hard to try to get our voice be heard in these spaces, and especially the media. And, in these past few weeks, for example, I was on Samantha Bee, and then I had an op-ed in New York Times, and that's the first time somebody has tried to listen to anybody from our community in roughly 20 years. When they do listen to Afghan voices, they pick these Afghan elites who are complicit in the pain and misery that's occurring there in the first place. And on the American side, they are picking people like Ambassador Crocker, who, had the audacity to also write in the New York Times, say that, the past 20 years, that was an acceptable cause. The status quo was okay. We should have just continued this on. And I explicitly very much link that to the devaluing of like Black and brown people overseas. Like we are having a conversation, a very new one, a very tough one, about America's role in racism, structural white supremacy. We see that in play overseas, when the media goes out of its way to not include voices on the ground. And, for example, the New Yorker posted this article, a really good one by Anand Gopal about, what was the result of this 20-year occupation? How did it affect actually Afghan women in rural areas? Something, we don't often talk about. And even that, it's has this problematic lens because it still devalues kind of these like complex experiences that Afghans have, and it doesn't center Afghans as much as it needs to. And so I think, I hope that those in the media take a hard look at themselves and try to find some really structural ways to change. Put it like we work within our organization to elevate marginalized and Afghan voices. And, and half of that game is trying to get the media to listen to us. But what happened in the past 20 years, it took a lot of complicity on behalf of a lot of different structures, and the media was part of that.
Appreciate that. I want to note also some comments coming in the chat, and so we appreciate those. We can see those as panelists, and just reiterate that if you have questions for our panelists, you can also put them into the chat, and we'll work to get them into the conversation. Pam, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to you, because we're just talking about the voices that the media often leaves out. But obviously, one of the voices that the media often does pay attention to is the veterans communities, the veterans' voice. They do give it a place of privilege. I am curious from your perspective as a veteran, both from your own experience of what you learned in the lessons from the war here, what you think is left out of the conversation by the focus on generals and elites within the military compared to the working members and the Black and brown members of the military who often aren't the ones who make it onto CNN. And any observations just that you might want to share in general about this dynamic that has been very prevalent over the last 20 years of prioritizing that voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I would say that the media, one of the biggest grifts in the US and in media is they love generals. They love bringing on generals as experts to do revisionism around their own hand as executives, military executives. So I would say that the media has a long time kind of reflexive tendency to look at generals as experts, and also there's this really bizarre allure that they are a power of authority, right? And I think it goes with our militarism culture. And then beyond that, the media really likes a very specific American hero, and the media really loves white, cisgendered, nationalistic veterans that will tell a story about the US military that feels really cozy and makes us the heroes and the victors and supremacists, frankly. And so my experience is that, especially in this last whirlwind of the media and everyone wanting veterans, veterans like myself, enlisted, vets of color, vets who will tell the truth about military and DoD lack of accountability. Those are not voices that are really welcome. And actually, it's really new to see more diverse voices of ex-military enlisted people and working class people who are willing to tell the truth, and in some ways whistleblow about the power dynamics in this space, and to tell the truth. What I often say is that there's a valor economy here, right? Part of the privilege of being a military veteran, I will say, is that people do listen to us. If I tell people that I'm a Latina, or that I'm an organizer, or that I'm the daughter of an immigrant, they won't listen. But when I say I'm an intelligence analyst, we have a culture where security, a security culture, right, where that takes precedent. And I think it's also the mystique, right? That's part of the grift is, well, you had a top secret clearance, so you must know things that we don't know. But frankly, a lot of this stuff is out in the open. And I think that it is about our own national trauma, our own inability to reconcile white supremacy within our own land. And what Arash said, I foot stomp it. I mean, the killing of Black and brown people in the United States and abroad is linked, right? If we feel so emboldened to not care about Black lives in the United States, which we know right now, right? So popular support for the movement for Black lives is decreasing. Then what do we think, particularly as a nationalistic, state? How are we going to further depreciate people that we see as the other, and also quote so far away? That's another part of this that I feel like is a huge dynamic, is, well, those aren't our people, we don't know them, while also just completely erasing the fact that there are real transnational, international connections to communities, right? And we're becoming an ever globalized society, but also these are our folks, like they're no different than you or I. And so how do we? I think that as a people, as a society, I keep coming back to it, is nationalism. Nationalism is growing in the United States. White supremacy is a new concept for many principals and elites in DC, and it is inconvenient to talk about the white supremacist model of security in the United States, right? Even though this is the thing that kills me, even though it is the thing that will save all of us, right? Even though by us moving away from hyper-militarism and imperialism and spending all these money on bombs and bullets that have not only not kept us safe, but actually created more destruction. To me, one of the most frightening things that I've seen is an inability to confront our own government agencies' dysfunction in this strategy that has failed fundamentally, because they are actually so insulated from it because of their whiteness, class. And I'll say the last part is, a lot of the veterans that have been centered in this fight are usually special operators, which means that it's so gendered, right? There was a lot of sharp elbowed, there's a lot of mystique around special ops and Navy SEALs, but it's deeply problematic because those are closed off to only men traditionally, even though people love to talk about, bringing more gender diversity into these roles. The bottom line is that they have a very explicit mission, which is extremely gendered, nationalistic, racist, and violent. And so those are the people that are kind of propped up as helpers. And the last thing I'll really say is there is a contest right now, right? Fundamentally, there is a popular consensus in the United States that war for war's sake is not only costly and damaging, but also dumb, right? We are embarrassed in some ways that we keep doing this thing where we are losing, and the United States psyche hates losing. But there's a real contest in front of us about if anti-war means, yes, let's get out of that place and just, point those guns towards Black and brown people in the United States, or if we're actually going to build a new world that has true global justice and repair.
It's powerful, Pam, and I really appreciate that. I want to ask you to build on it for one more second before I go back to ask Nita something. And I want to come back to something you said, which is I love the the importance that you note that often our expertise is dismissed unless we can have some sort of hard security validation, and the role that the white supremacy and colonialism plays in that. And I want to quickly share that I remember starting out in 10 years ago at Win Without War and working on the drawdown of Afghanistan during the Obama surge, and being told that I should really go to Kabul on a trip sometime and be there for a couple of days to feel like, to then have credibility to talk about this, as if being at the airport for a couple hours in Kabul would simply give me the credibility as a cisgendered straight white guy in Washington, D.C. to pontificate whatever I wanted about Afghanistan. So I think these things are deeply, deeply rooted in every aspect of our community. And so I want to go back to two ways you identified yourself as a Latina and as a community organizer, and say the work you're doing with the Working Families Party, one of this, premier institutions kind of working to change American politics. How do you see these issues as a Latina, as a community organizer, to the point you're just making? How do we connect and show the interconnection between our militarism abroad and our militarism at home? How do we show the lessons learned from our failures in Afghanistan are the same that we're learning about our failures in the war on drugs, and our over-policing here is connected into our over-militarization abroad? Is there a way, not to put you on the spot, this is kind of a big thing, I apologize, but is there a lesson you're seeing in there that you think connects those two, and you are able to put together in your work that you're doing as a community organizer right now?
Mm-hmm. My biggest dream is that we transfer power from people that are oligarchs to everyday people. And that's what the Working Family aspires to do, is to radically transform and change power in America so that we can have true equity. And I think, over the last 10 years doing anti-militarism organizing and anti-war organizing, this keeps being a place, and I say this with so much love to the progressive movement, to progressive organizers, but y'all, we have to look at ourselves and how at every time that there is an international crisis that is really at the hands of the United States voting, like the folks that we elected, standing in the way of progress, that we as a progressive movement trip. It's always this trip. It's always this trip that happens because we have not deepened and connected our movements to understand internationalism, global justice. I mean, it's interesting to me that we're still in 2021 and the conversation around border security, migration, and asylum. Asylum is in contest right now, right? The fact that we can't waive fees for Afghan, asylum seekers is wild. And the other thing too, I'll say is that, everyone says, well, we just can't do it. We just can't do it. We just can't waive all those fees. We just can't, change and reorganize the CIA. We can't, it is not true. It is not true. We cannot be the most powerful and wealthy country in the world and say that we can't reorganize our own government to actually serve the needs of the people, period. And we need to have an analysis on war and violence and global justice that connects and that helps. Everyday people, working class people, are not dumb, and we need to respect our base a lot more. Everyday people understand intimately what insecurity means and how bombs and bullets and, exactly as been said, all these costs are actually robbing us of a future, robbing us of our resources, and making it actually harder for us to have true, genuine safety and security in the United States and abroad, right? So, our global challenges are, I feel like the challenges in front of us, white nationalism, power grab in the United States, climate insecurity, political violence here at the polls here in the United States, but also, groups like the Taliban and other authoritarian conservative groups rising to power and governance across the world. These are the threats in front of us, and working class people who believe in a multiracial democracy, we need to facilitate that fusion now.
Nita, I want to turn to you because Pam was just talking about the theft, and I think you laid that out earlier, the opportunity costs. And I am struck that we are having this conversation while the town that I'm sitting in, Washington, D.C., is obsessed about, whether or not we can possibly afford 3.5 trillion over the next decade to make investments, and how we can't do that, and we have to pay for it, and all these other aspects. And I wonder if you can dig in both a little bit more about the opportunity cost, but in your analysis as an expert and observer on this, why is there almost no debate when we want to spend more for war, right? When we want to give an extra 25 billion, quarter of a trillion over 10 years to the Pentagon, as we just did, that goes by uncontested. When we spend trillions on these wars, that goes by uncontested. Yet we have, we act as if we don't have any money when we want to invest in these other needs and kind of the actual things that would bring people safety and security. So maybe, again, just a word on the kind of interconnection of those two debates, and why we struggle so much to have an honest conversation around what we can and can't afford.
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that the authorizations that the Pentagon does essentially happen, or gets from the Congress, essentially happen uncontested. The budget that the Pentagon produces is, enormous, and it's uncontested for two reasons. One, it's to fund ongoing activities, and they fund it piecemeal into the future, right? So we know that we'll be building aircraft carriers in not just 2030, but 2040. We know that there's a long pipeline for replacement of equipment, and these budgetary conversations are not accessible, I think, to most of us. And that's one problem. But the larger question here is, of course, 3.5 trillion is affordable over 10 years. We've spent about 6 trillion over 20 years on something that's extremely unproductive. If we'd spent that money, a few million of it more, for every $1 million that you spend on the military, you get about 8 jobs, directly and indirectly. You spent that same $1 million on healthcare, you'd get twice that. Education, many more jobs. Construction, green industry, many more jobs. So the opportunity cost is enormous. It's all actually much more productive in terms of the ripple effects in the economy, and that we have a stronger economy. But I think to go back to the reason why, it's not just that it's difficult to understand the budgets. It goes to what Pam was talking about in terms of this sort of underlying culture of militarism. And there's two aspects of that. One is that the fact that the military's norms are uncontested helps to diminish democracy. And in fact, it's like a seesaw. The more militarism, the more military spending, the less democracy. The more democracy, the less militarized, because these are two conflicting norms. One says that it's okay to take what you want with brute force, and that can include a highly militarized police force. And the other says, no, we're going to take force off the table, and we'll talk, and we'll come to an agreement. So these are two fundamentally opposed norms. So when the military comes before Congress, and basically Congress members act like a president and salute and hand over the United States wallet, it's because we don't question that fundamental belief that might makes right, that force is okay, and if that force works. And if you want to think about it in terms of recent events, Catherine Ballou's book, Bring the War Home, which talks about how veterans both enlisted in the military to get training and then went into white nationalist organizations, or were, after they left the military, were attracted to white nationalist organizations, tells us that there's this, that the violence sometimes cannot be shut off. And in fact, it's no accident that some of the people that we think of as the most horrific people, for instance, Timothy McVeigh, who did the Oklahoma City bombing, were veterans. It's not an accident. So, but just really quickly, Pam, you said that Hearts and Minds goes back to the Vietnam War. It actually goes back to the American Revolution, and the British said it. They wanted to win our hearts and minds. And then we have, the United States has said, in the US-Mexico War, we wanted to win their hearts and minds. And in the war in the Philippines, we wanted to win hearts and minds. It was called benevolent assimilation. And on and on. And what's interesting is it doesn't work. Okay, but it's still better than brute force. The problem is it's always hand in hand with brute force, right? And who would want to give their hearts and minds to somebody who's just bombed you? It's really hard to imagine. Anyway, enough said.
It's the beginning of I wish we had 4 hours to get into all that, because it's not nearly enough said, if I think I'm being honest, Nina. But Arash, I do want to turn to you, because I think Nina just brings a, I think there's an underlying part about the humanity that we deny when we often are talking about hearts and minds. We act as if it's something that can be purchased, and we erase the humanity of the very people we're talking about. So I want to give you a chance to talk about being an Afghan American, but also about the country that your family came from, because it's often in these conversations simply a place that is discussed as a place that we're bombing, or a place unto which we need to pursue a hearts and minds strategy. But it's a home. It's a country that your family called home. It's a country that tens of millions of people live in right now. I want to both give you a chance to talk about that, and maybe as an intro to that, I also want to give you a chance to acknowledge that the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan didn't begin in 2001, and it certainly hasn't ended now. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit more about the history of the U.S. in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah, I mean, usually when I'm on a panel like this, I talk about my family's history, because I'm a product of displacement. I'm an American citizen now, but I'm a product of displacement. My family fled in 1980 and 1984. My parents. But I am a product of U.S. imperialism, and I'm a product of U.S. foreign policy, and I'm a product of also interference by neighboring countries, Russia and Pakistan. That is at the heart of the work I do. Displacement, because explicitly Afghan lives were devalued, and Black and brown people were just not valued, and that goes back past these 20 years. And we talk about violence in these, Pam mentioned the kinetic military things, like we talk about drone strikes, we talk about bombings, and we talk about occupation. But violence for my people also looks in so many different ways, I personally am one of the lucky ones. I didn't have to float on a boat to Greece. I wasn't the victim of a drone strike. I was not targeted in a bombing by the Taliban or ISIS. I never had to look a U.S. soldier or coalition soldier in the eye, and me and my family are one of the lucky ones. And still, we are a deeply traumatized people. And so violence can look one certain way, but my people are experiencing violence again, applying for humanitarian parole, which, by the way, is not even close to a guarantee of asylum. It's to gain entry to file for asylum. This is the U.S. immigration system. That is violence. Filing $575 for that humanitarian parole application, that is violent. When people are emptying out their savings and maxing out their credit cards, that's also violent. For the U.S. to kind of normalize relationships when the director of the CIA is meeting with the Taliban, that is also inherently violent. And so this violence continues in so many different ways. The world is not open to taking in refugees. And so right now, what we are dealing with is getting messages from people inside the country who are desperate for evacuation, but they can't get visas. They can't get a passport. They are stuck in transit. For example, the United States is saying file for a humanitarian parole application, $575 per person. For a family of 4, that's almost $3,000. For a family of 8, that's even more. Then they're saying go to a third country, stick it out there. And then maybe you can come to the United States. And so there's all these violent mechanisms that are in place. And And I think the framing of the 20-year war, like yesterday we were at Raytheon to protest, to hold a direct action, to hold them responsible and hold them accountable for the actions that they are partaking in, the complicity of profiting over, dead Afghan lives. But that history goes way back, like in the end, I'm a product of displacement because of US foreign policy during the Cold War. And it's just a continuation of the past. And for us to move past that, there has to be this like larger reckoning amongst ourselves, not just in the media, but also in our little corners. Like, why did we not care about Afghanistan? Like there was this crisis moment in August, and we saw just the pain and misery at the airport. But that pain and misery was also happening in July and June and last year and the year before that and the year before that. But nobody was paying attention to the Afghan people. Now they kind of are. And now we are also seeing the spotlight kind of move on. But when I come here, I think about my friend who now doesn't live there anymore, who had to flee. But in January, you opened up a coffee shop. And in my eyes, I was like, hey, like the United States is withdrawing. Like this might be a risky time to start a new coffee shop. And a coffee shop in Kabul, it was this special place. It's a community spot. It's a meeting place. People go on dates there very covertly almost. And he opened up a coffee shop. And now that dream, that aspiration of starting a business, it's gone. It's been shattered. And the US is complicit in that. The West is complicit in that. These larger institutions in the West are complicit in that. And so I want people to kind of remember when they think of Afghanistan, they think of the violence and the drone strikes and the pain and misery, but there were hopes and aspirations there. There were dreams of everyday people. And that has been shattered too. But that doesn't mean that people here in the US or elsewhere in the West don't have a continued moral obligation to continue to elevate Afghan voices, to continue to uplift our demands and to find ways to work with us and uplift what's going to be a very long road ahead and trying to give people hope again, to uplift their dreams and aspirations. Maybe not in Afghanistan, but maybe in places like, Washington, D.C., Kansas, and Los Angeles.
Thank you, Arash. We're running up on time, and so I want to come back to Arash to close in a minute, but I want to give you each a chance to say, obviously, we have a number of people listening, and the chat's been really helpful and appreciating seeing fellow refugees there, commenters enjoying the conversation and points that were made, and so appreciate you watching. And of course, this will be online, so folks who couldn't watch it today will be able to watch it later. So a lot of activists will have a chance to see this and hear the conversation. And I'd love maybe to start with you, Nita, and then with Pam. What do you want people to take away from our comments today, and anything that you want to encourage them to do, take action coming out of this about the situation and the issues we've discussed today?
I think two things occur to mind right away. One is that the costs and consequences of the post 9/11 wars, not least of which is Afghanistan, were foreseeable and foreseen. And this is a tragedy that was foreseeable and foreseen. If we do anything, we have to question a couple of things about US policy. So my priority going forward would be to ask if we've learned that force didn't work here, and in fact, in many instances doesn't work at all, can we not invest in the other tools and think about, these assumptions much more critically, that war is quick, cheap, controllable, it won't escalate, and that there'll be few casualties. We're told that all the time, and the next time we're told to buy a war, perhaps we should be less willing to go along and look back over the history of the US and see that investing in war has led to us devaluing other means of getting on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pam?
This feels like a lot. This is what I'm saying to people that are watching. This feels like a behemoth, but what Arash said, we have what we need to reckon with this, and we must, at minimum, in our movement, in our local communities and in our organizations. This is not a nice to have, meaning a lens around peace and security and understanding of Afghanistan. This is fundamental about who we are and how the progressive movement will move forward. If you know military veterans that share our values, I need you to move them to Vets for the People, the project that I'm a part of, where we're training military veterans. And I say this because we are key. January 6th has shown us, right, that veterans can go one of two ways, right? And I am very concerned about hate crimes in the following year as we absorb Afghan refugees. And that is a responsibility for all of us. If you're a veteran, military connected, if you've never even, had a connective tissue with Afghanistan, it is our duty now to demand different. And I think we have to really look at the principles of this administration, at the State Department, at DOD. Now is the time for accountability, because if we don't do this now, 2024 is going to be a real problem. And so I encourage all of us to see this as a duty. Even if you feel like my issue area has nothing to do with this, bet if you talk to one of us after this, we'll let you know how it does actually, right? And so we cannot see this anymore as our own piecemeal appendage to the progressive agenda. This is fundamental. And when I say this, it's accountability for the global war on terror, for our inhumane and cruel asylum and immigration system, and militarism, the robbery of defense corporations and contractors that are really taking over. So that's what I'll say. And the last thing I'll say is I have hope. The Afghanistan crisis is one of the most traumatic things I've witnessed. And I've also seen helpers without ego and no sharp elbows that are doing the work. And we cannot be thin on this front. We need more helpers.
Thank you, Pam. And I, as someone who works in this space, often lose hope as well. And so, but I will say I share that hope. And one of the very reasons is having seen the brilliance of Nita and Pam, both of you through many years of work, but Arash, getting to work with you and watch you over the last few weeks has been incredibly filling in terms of hope for me. And so I want to give you the final word here to close us out.
Yeah, I think I also come to these things with a call to action, and my call to action today is to dream with us. I might be a product of displacement, I might be children of refugees, but I still dream every day, despite all the sheer immense pain where my inboxes are filled with just desperate pleas for evacuation with people that I can't help. And I have PTSD from that, and everybody in our community has PTSD from that, because we are feeling hopeless and despair. And despite that, I say, dream with us. When I say that I want Raytheon to stop existing as a company and to absolve their assets and to give to the Afghan people, I am being that serious about that. And I want people to stop maybe scoffing at that and to come join us and to dream with us and live in these clouds, because that world for a better tomorrow, Afghans for better tomorrow is the name of our organization, that is really possible. And so there's also things in play that are about harm reduction, for example. We want drone strikes to end, because I know the war is over, quote unquote. It's probably not, we need to continue to have people who stand with us. And I would say, we're ready to lead. Come join us in this fight, because it's going to take a while. And it's about that. It's about climate justice. It's about Haitians on the border. It's a big fight, and we need as many people as we can.
Thank you so much, Arash. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank everyone in the chat and everyone who was viewing today. You can go to the website for this panel, and again in the app, to find Twitter handles of how to follow folks. You can Google the organizations Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, the Cost of War Project, Vets for the People, and the Working Families Party. And I just want to thank you all one more time. And I wish we were all together in person so that we could all stand at the front of the stage and people could come ask us questions and all those great things. So I'm hopeful that we'll be together in person soon. And just thank you all from the bottom of my heart for joining us for the conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Stephen, for organizing this.